Hi, good morning. Today we can discuss fourth chapter. Do you know our fourth chapter? Yeah, we have to discuss Keynes and his contributions in our fourth chapter. We have already studied about Keynes. John Maynard Keynes has been one of the greatest and most controversial economists of 20th century. We heard several times about Keynes. He lived during 1883 to 1946. Simply we can call him as J.M. Keynes or Keynes. He was the very famous economist of 20th century. His book, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, marked as a turning point in the history of economic thought. His famous book, that is, was an essay, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, marks a turning point in history of our economic thought. He was architect of new economics. Architect of new economics. Then he was a member of the Royal Commission of Indian Currency and Finance. He was a architect of new economics. He was member of the Royal Commission of Indian Currency and Finance during 1913 to 14. His famous works are Indian Currency and Finance, then The Economic Consequence of Peace, The End of Laissez-faire, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and How to Pay for the War. So, his famous works are Indian Currency and Finance, The Economic Consequence of Peace, The End of Laissez-faire, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, How to Pay for the War. Then we can compare classical idea and Keynesian idea. The classical economist concerned with the distribution of social product rather than its amount. But Keynes was interested in analyzing the factors that determine level of output or income or employment at any time. Keynes was interested in analyzing the factors that determined level of output or income or employment at any time. But the classical economist concerned with the distribution of social product rather than the amount. Keynes thoroughly analyzed the factors determine the output or income or employment at any time. The classical approach is microeconomic approach, which is intended in problem of partial equilibrium analysis. What is microeconomic approach? Yeah, it studies only in-depth study and study individual behavior and only partial equilibrium. But Keynes' approach is macroeconomic approach. What is macroeconomic approach? Yeah, it gives bird's eye view, or it is a comprehensive study, wide study about the wide and comprehensive study about the economy. Then macroeconomic approach deals with the general equilibrium analysis. Then classical economics based on the assumption of full employment equilibrium that we have already understood. Classical's main assumption was full employment theory. Keynes rejected this and explained underemployment equilibrium. So Keynes completely rejected, criticized the full employment equilibrium, and he explained new concept as underemployment equilibrium. Then classical economists studied economics from the point of long run equilibrium. Long run means that we have already understood in the concept of Marshall. Long run means it will take too much years. So classical economists studied economics from the point of long run equilibrium, but Keynes told us in the long run we all dead. So Keynes strongly stressed to study about short run. Short run means very short run, less years. We will live very less years, not long run. All men are dead in the long run. Then, so Keynes studied, emphasized short run equilibrium. Then classical economists praised saving as thrift. Keynes advocated spending and thriftlessness during the period of depression. Classical economists promoted saving and thrift. Thrift means we have not spent anything. All money is keeping. Keynes advocated spending. He promoted to spend our money, and thriftlessness, opposite of thrift, during the period of depression. Then classical agreed theory of Pigou, that is policy of general cut in wage to solve the problem of unemployment. But Keynes opposed this policy. He expressed cut in wage create more problems in the economy. Classical agreed theory of Pigou, policy of general cut in wage to solve the problem of unemployment. That means classical believed full employment, but Pigou explained cut in wage to solve the problem of unemployment. If any unemployment will create in the economy, that means excess of labor. So Pigou explained to solve this problem, if employer will reduce the present wage level, then he can appoint more laborers to that situation. Actually, it is not a good method. If now we are living in the present situation within terms of cash in our hand, if any cut in our wage, it will create so many problems to us. We have to pay tuition fee for our children. Then parents have to spend so much purpose. So if any reduction in their wage or salary, it will create so many problems. Now we are living in the period of pandemic situation. So many laborers have affected problem in their wage. So many employers were reduced their wage. So employees are suffering lot of problem because they cannot compensate reduced wage for their whole purpose. So Keynes completely rejected this policy and he expressed cut in wage create more problem. Then classical analyzed economic problem in static terms. Keynes introduced dynamic element. Classical analyzed economic problem in static term. Keynes introduced dynamic element. Dynamic element means there are so many changes will occur. Static means it is a fixed position, no change. Everything is constant. So classical studied their economic concept in static term, but Keynes introduced its opposite case, that is dynamic. Everything will change. Then classical believed interest as a reward for waiting. Classical believed interest as a reward for waiting. But Keynes introduced the element of liquidity preference in his theory, and rate of interest was determined by the liquidity. Classical believed interest as a reward for waiting, but Keynes introduced element of liquidity preference in his theory, and rate of interest was determined by the liquidity. That we can study in later what is liquidity. Now you just study this concept. Classical believed interest is a reward for waiting, but Keynes introduced element of liquidity preference in his theory, and rate of interest was determined by liquidity. Liquidity means everything will solve. Classical advocated balanced budget, but Keynes explained deficit budget. Classical advocated balanced budget, but Keynes explained deficit budget. Balanced budget means revenue equal to expenditure. Deficit budget means expenditure is higher than revenue, that is income of the government. Expenditure of the government is higher than income of the government. Then classical believed in laissez-faire policy. Keynes expressed government is compulsory. That we know what is laissez-faire policy. It was the major idea of the classical economists. So they believed in, classicals believed in laissez-faire policy, but Keynes expressed the government is compulsory for a state. Then we can study Keynesian theory of employment. The starting point of Keynesian theory of employment is principle of effective demand. Total employment depends upon total demand. Total employment depends upon total demand in the society. Unemployment results from deficiency of total demand. Total employment depends upon total demand. Unemployment results from deficiency of total demand. This Keynesian theory of employment that we have already studied in the detailed manner from macroeconomics. So here we have to just analyze the concept only. Then aggregate demand, aggregate income, aggregate output also explained by the Keynes for this theory. Employment depends on demand, and aggregate demand is equal to aggregate income. Employment depends on demand of the society, and aggregate demand, aggregate means total demand of the society is equal to aggregate income, that is whole people income. Hence general theory of employment is a theory of employment is theory of aggregate demand or aggregate income, because employment depends on demand, demand depends upon income. So total general employment is a theory of aggregate demand or aggregate income. Since the total value of output is equal to total income, total value of output is equal to total income. His theory is also called theory of aggregate output. This theory is also called theory of aggregate output. Employment results in production of output on the one hand and on the creation of income on the other hand. Employment results in production of output on the one hand and creation of income on the other hand. So, employment is directly related to income and output in the economy. So, general theory of employment of Keynes depends upon the effective demand from the society. All people are purchasing every day. So, total demand from the society is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand depends upon the total income. This aggregate income is also called aggregate is equal to aggregate output. His theory is also called aggregate output. So, employment results in the production of output, production of anything in the one hand and the creation of income on the other side. Okay. The next theories, next concept of Keynes can be discussed in the next class. Thank you.